You're coming with me." The words cut through the dry air like a knife. Clara stood on the dusty platform, a ghost in a worn travel dress. The train had hissed its last breath, leaving behind a silence so deep it hurt. Her body ached, a road map of purple and yellowed bruises hidden beneath a thin shawl. She was 50 years old, shipped west like unwanted cargo, a mail-order bride no one had bothered to claim. The letter in her satchel, filled with promises of a new life, now felt like a cruel joke. The whispers of the townsfolk had already started. They saw the swell of her cheekbone, the way she held herself stiffly, and they looked away. Pity was a currency they didn't trade in Dust Hollow. She'd been waiting for a man named Elias Vance, a man whose photograph showed a thin smile and kind eyes, a man who had promised her safety. But the man standing before her was not Elias Vance. This man was taller, built like an old oak, with a face carved by sun and wind. His eyes were the color of the earth, steady and deep. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that felt alien to her. He didn't stare at her bruises, but he didn't ignore them either. He just looked at her, straight and level. "You're coming with me," he repeated, his voice quiet, gravelly, but firm. It wasn't a command. It was a statement of fact. Clara's lips parted, but her voice was a locked room she'd lost the key to long ago. All her life, men had told her what to do. Fathers, brothers, foremen. Their voices were whips and chains. This was different. There was no leash in his tone, no bargain. "You can refuse," the man added, softer now. He must have seen the terror in her eyes. "But it's better to make choices with a roof over your head, not out here where the shadows get long." Her chest ached with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It felt something like mercy. She gave a single, small nod. Her weary feet had no choice but to follow. The wagon waiting outside was plain, painted a faded blue. A patched calico cushion sat on the seat. A small kindness. When you carry bruises, small kindnesses feel like miracles. He helped her up, his hand hovering near her elbow, but never touching, letting her find her own balance. The silence on the ride out of town wasn't cruel. It was a thick, warm blanket. The road led to a homestead that wasn't grand, but it was whole. The fences were mended. The porch was swept clean. The barn roof was straight as a prayer. This was a place where things were cared for. He helped her down, and again he simply stood by, a silent guardian in case she stumbled. Inside, the kitchen smelled of soap and old coffee. He gestured to a basin of fresh water. "Take your time," he said, and his voice was the first gentle thing she had heard in years. Her hands shook as she unwrapped her shawl. In the small, cracked mirror, her reflection was a stranger. Silver in her hair, purple on her jaw, but her eyes were still alive. She pressed a cool cloth to her skin, wincing. Then she saw it. On the wall next to the stove hung a single framed photograph. It was the man from the letter, Elias Vance. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through the fragile warmth she'd started to feel. Why was his picture in this stranger's house? Before she could ask, the man set a plate of warm cornbread on the table beside her. "Eat first," he murmured, his back to the photograph. "Decisions can wait." She stared at the bread, then at his broad back. He was hiding something. This place of safety suddenly felt like the most dangerous place on earth. The man from the photograph was here, yet not here. And this stranger, this quiet, gentle man, who was he really? And what did he want with her? The cornbread tasted like ash in her mouth. His name was Thomas. He told her that as she ate, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the fork. He sat across the simple wooden table, his presence filling the small kitchen. He didn't watch her eat. Instead, he stared into his cup of coffee like he was reading the future in its black depths. The photograph of Elias Vance seemed to watch them both from the wall. "You were expecting him," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Clara just nodded, her throat too tight for words. "He's my neighbor," Thomas stated, his voice flat. "His ranch is a few miles east. He couldn't make it to the station today. He sent me." The explanation was simple, plausible, but it didn't calm the fear coiling in her gut. Why would a man send a stranger to collect his mail-order bride? And why did Thomas have his picture hanging in his own kitchen? Friendship in the West was one thing, but this felt strange. It felt wrong. "You'll stay here for the night?" Thomas continued, standing to clear his plate. "The ride to his place is rough. Better to go in the morning light." He showed her to a small room off the kitchen. It was sparse but clean, with a bed covered in a quilt pieced together in a pattern of stars. It looked soft. It looked safe. But as she lay down, the exhaustion of the journey warring with the terror in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling of being a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She listened to the sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards as Thomas moved in the main room, the clink of a cup being set down, the scrape of a chair. These were ordinary sounds, the sounds of a home. But to her they were the sounds of a cage being locked. Sleep wouldn't come. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster. Who was Elias Vance, and who truly was Thomas? The man who showed her quiet kindness, but whose eyes held a sadness so deep it looked like a permanent shadow. Hours later, when the house was finally still and the coyotes were singing their lonely songs to the moon, a desperate curiosity took hold. She had to know more. Slipping out of the star quilt bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor, she crept back into the kitchen. The room was bathed in pale moonlight. The photograph of Elias Vance was a dark square on the wall. Her gaze fell upon the mantel above the hearth. Next to a tin of tobacco sat a worn leather-bound book. A ledger, perhaps, or a journal. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. It felt heavy, filled with secrets. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise. It wasn't a ledger. It was a diary. But the name written on the inside cover wasn't Thomas. It was his wife's. And the last entry, dated almost a year ago to the day, was only 3 words long. "He knows. God help me." A floorboard creaked behind her. Clara slammed the journal shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She spun around. Thomas stood in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the faint light from the hall. He wasn't holding a lamp. He was holding a rifle. His face was unreadable in the shadows, but his voice was cold, stripped of all its earlier kindness. "You shouldn't have seen that." The air crackled with a tension so thick she could barely breathe. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place stood a man with a gun and a terrible secret. The journal in her hands felt like a death sentence. Her mind raced, scrambling for an escape that didn't exist. The front door was on the other side of him. The windows were too small. She was trapped. What did his wife know? The words tumbled out of her mouth, a desperate, foolish whisper. Thomas took a step forward, the rifle held loosely but purposefully at his side. "Some things are better left buried, Clara. For your own good." Buried. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. The townsfolk whispered. Thomas's wife was gone, a journal with a terrified last entry, and now a man with a rifle in a moonlit kitchen. The pieces clicked together into a picture of pure horror. He hadn't just lost his wife. He had buried her, and he was afraid Clara had just uncovered the proof. "Elias Vance," she stammered, backing away until her spine hit the cold stone of the hearth. "Does he know? Is that why he sent you? To get rid of me?" A strange, dark smile touched Thomas's lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "Elias knows nothing. He didn't send me." The blood drained from Clara's face. "What? But you said—" "I lied," Thomas said, taking another slow, deliberate step. The rifle was starting to rise. Elias wasn't at the station because he's been gone for 2 days. Went to the city for supplies. He doesn't even know you've arrived. The entire foundation of her situation crumbled into dust. He hadn't been sent. He had intercepted her. He had seen a lone, bruised woman get off the train, a woman no one would miss, and he had brought her to his isolated ranch, a ranch where his wife had disappeared. "Who are you?" she breathed, true terror finally finding its voice. "I'm the man who's going to offer you a choice," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble. "You can forget everything you saw tonight. You can get on that wagon in the morning and I'll take you to the Vance Ranch. You can marry him, live out your days on his dusty plot of land and never speak of this again." He paused, letting the offer settle. It was a chance at the life she had come for. A life of servitude, perhaps, but a life nonetheless. "Or," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the dark barrel of the rifle. "Or," Thomas said, his eyes glinting in the moonlight, "you can help me." Help him? Help a man who likely murdered his wife? The question was insane. It was a trap. He was testing her, trying to see if she could be trusted to keep his secret. But there was something in his voice, a raw, desperate edge that hadn't been there before. "Help you do what?" "Jace," she asked, her mind spinning. "Help me prove I didn't kill my wife." The twist was so sharp, so unexpected, it knocked the air from her lungs. This wasn't a confession. It was a plea. The man holding the rifle wasn't a predator trying to silence a witness. He was a man drowning, and he was asking her for a rope. But it made no sense. The journal, the disappearance, the lie about Elias. It all pointed to his guilt. "Why would I help you?" she asked, her voice shaking but a little stronger now. "Why should I believe you?" Thomas lowered the rifle, resting its stock on the floor. The gesture was a small offering of peace. "Because the same man who hurt my wife is the man you're supposed to marry." The room tilted. Elias Vance, the man with the kind eyes in the photograph, the man who was supposed to be her salvation. According to this stranger, this potential murderer, her intended groom was the real monster. It was an impossible choice. Trust the man with the gun who admitted to lying, or trust the man in the picture who might be the reason a woman vanished into thin air. "My wife's name was Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice now filled with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. "And she was terrified of Elias Vance. That journal, it's filled with what he did. The threats, the visits when I was away. He wanted our land. He wanted our water rights. He told her he'd do anything to get it. The day she disappeared, she was supposed to meet me in town to see the sheriff." He looked up from the floor, and for the first time Clara saw past the shadows in his eyes to the raw pain behind them. "She never made it. They found her horse wandering by the creek. Her shawl was torn and snagged on a branch. But they never found her. The sheriff, he's Elias's cousin. He called it an accident, said she must have fallen in the river and been washed away. A convenient story, a family affair." "So you brought me here," Clara pieced it together, her voice barely a whisper. "You saw me at the station, bruised and alone, a mail-order bride for Elias. You thought, I thought you were walking into the same trap she was in," Thomas finished. "I saw the look in your eyes. I've seen it before, in Eleanor's mirror. I lied to get you out of town, to give you a chance to think, to warn you." He gestured toward the journal in her hands. "That last entry. He knows. She wasn't talking about me. She was talking about Elias. She'd found proof of his cattle rustling, of how he'd been cheating his neighbors for years. She wrote it all down. She was going to use it to stop him. It was a story. A well-crafted, believable story that explained everything. Or it was the most cunning lie she had ever heard. So, the choice. Thomas said, his gaze unwavering. "Do you go to him in the morning, or do you stay here with me and help me find out what really happened to Eleanor? Help me find the proof she hid." Clara looked from the journal in her hands to the rifle leaning against the table, then to the photograph of Elias Vance on the wall. The kind eyes in the picture now seemed cold, predatory. Her life had been a series of choices made for her by cruel men. Now, for the first time, she was being given a real choice, a dangerous, terrifying choice. Side with the suspected killer to take down a respected neighbor, or walk into the arms of a man who might be a monster. She clutched the journal to her chest. It was the only solid thing in a world that had just been turned upside down. "Where do we start?" she asked. A flicker of relief, so faint it was almost imperceptible, crossed Thomas's face. He picked up the rifle, but this time it felt less like a threat and more like a tool. "We start with the one place the sheriff never bothered to look," he said, his voice low and determined. "Eleanor's sewing room." It was a small, dusty room at the back of the house, crowded with bolts of fabric, baskets of thread, and a half-finished quilt draped over a chair. It felt frozen in time, a silent testament to a life interrupted. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and cedar. For a moment, Clara felt like an intruder, a ghost stepping into another ghost's private world. Thomas stood in the doorway, his large frame seeming to shrink in the presence of his wife's things. "She loved this room," he murmured. "Said it was the only place the dust of the prairie couldn't get to her." He looked lost. For all his certainty in the kitchen, here he was just a grieving husband, overwhelmed. It was Clara who took the first step, her instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, taking over. If Eleanor had hidden something, she would have hidden it in plain sight, in a place a man would never think to look. "Men always look in boxes under floorboards," Clara said, almost to herself. "They look for things that are locked away. A woman hides things inside other things." Her eyes scanned the room, the baskets of yarn, the tins of buttons, the rows of neatly spooled thread. It was too much. It could be anywhere. She ran a hand over the half-finished quilt. The pattern was intricate, a series of interlocking stars. She remembered the quilt on her own bed. Eleanor had a fondness for stars. "What was she like?" Clara asked, turning to Thomas. He seemed startled by the personal question. "She was quiet but strong, like a river that runs deep. She saw things other people missed. She noticed the way a bird built its nest, or the way the wind changed before a storm." Clara nodded slowly. A woman who paid attention to details. She turned back to the room. Her gaze landed on a tall wooden cabinet filled with dozens of glass jars. They were filled with seeds, flower seeds, vegetable seeds, all meticulously labeled in Eleanor's neat hand. A man searching the room would dismiss them instantly. Clara walked over to the cabinet. She ran her fingers along the cool glass of the jars. Poppy, marigold, beans, corn. Then she saw it. A single jar at the back of a shelf, half hidden behind a large jar of sunflower seeds. The label on this jar was different. It wasn't a type of seed. It was a single cryptic word. Justice. Her breath caught in her throat. She carefully pulled the jar from the shelf. It was lighter than the others. It didn't rattle with the sound of seeds. She twisted the metal lid. It came off with a soft groan. Inside, nestled in a bed of raw cotton, was not a seed packet. It was a small brass key, and tied to the key with a piece of blue ribbon was a tightly folded piece of paper. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. Clara unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a map, crudely drawn but clear. It showed the layout of the ranch, their land, and the adjoining Vance property. A single spot was marked with a star, just like the ones on the quilts. The spot was on the far edge of Thomas's property, near the old, dry creek bed. Next to the star were two words: "My proof "What is it?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "It's a map," Clara said, handing it to him. "She hid something. Something she called her proof." Thomas stared at the paper, his knuckles white. "The old line cabin," he whispered. "It's near the creek. It hasn't been used in years. I never thought—" Suddenly, a loud banging on the front door shattered the quiet of the morning. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the sound of authority, demanding entry. Thomas's head snapped up, his brief moment of hope instantly replaced by a grim tension. He shoved the map into his pocket and moved toward the front of the house, Clara close behind him. Through the front window, they could see a man on horseback. He wore a dusty coat and a silver star pinned to his chest, the sheriff. But he wasn't alone. Sitting on the horse next to him, a smug, confident smile on his face, was the man from the photograph, Elias Vance. Elias swung down from his horse, his boots crunching on the gravel. His eyes, which had looked so kind in the photograph, were now cold and hard as pebbles. They scanned the house, lingering on the front window where he must have seen a flicker of movement. "Thomas," he called out, his voice smooth but laced with an undeniable menace. "My cousin, the sheriff here, tells me my bride arrived on the train yesterday. Funny thing is, she never made it to my door. We checked the station. They said you gave her a ride." The sheriff, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache, remained silent, letting Elias do the talking. His presence was a clear endorsement. This wasn't a friendly visit. Thomas opened the door, positioning himself to block the entrance. "She's here, Elias. She was tired from the journey. I offered her a place to rest for the night." Elias's thin smile widened, but it held no warmth. "How thoughtful of you, neighbor, especially after all the trouble you've had lately. A man who loses a wife, then picks up a new woman at the train station. People might get the wrong idea." The threat was clear. He was painting Thomas as a predator, a dangerous man, using Clara as the bait. Elias's eyes flicked past Thomas's shoulder and landed on Clara. She felt his gaze like a physical touch, cold and appraising. It was the look of a man pricing cattle at an auction, the look she had seen her whole life. "There you are," Elias said, his voice dripping with false charm. "Clara, is it? I do apologize for the delay. I was detained on business. I've come to take you home." He extended a hand toward her. Clara stayed rooted behind Thomas, her heart pounding. The map in Thomas's pocket felt like it was burning a hole through his trousers. The proof was out there, just a short ride away. But between them and the truth stood her intended husband and the law. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice a low grumble. "Ma'am, is this man holding you here against your will?" It was a direct question, a loaded question. If she said yes, the sheriff would have cause to arrest Thomas, to search the house, to tear it apart until he found— what? He didn't know about the map. But Elias's eyes were sharp. He was looking for something. He was nervous. If she said no, she was casting her lot with Thomas, a man she barely knew, against the law and the man her family had sold her to. She would be an outcast, an accomplice. This was the real choice. Not the one in the moonlit kitchen, but here, in the harsh light of day. Elias's smile faltered slightly as she hesitated. "Don't be afraid, my dear," he cooed. "Thomas has a reputation in this town. If he's threatened you, you just tell the sheriff." Clara looked at Thomas. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the plea for her to trust him. Then she looked at Elias, and behind the charming mask, she saw a flicker of the same cold cruelty she had seen in her own brother's eyes. It was the look of a bully, a man who took what he wanted and crushed anyone who stood in his way. She had been running from men like Elias her whole life. She was tired of running. She took a small step forward, moving to stand beside Thomas, not behind him. She lifted her chin and met the sheriff's gaze. He is not holding me against my will, she said, her voice clear and steady. Mr. Thomas has been a perfect gentleman. I chose to stay. Elias's face darkened, the charming facade crumbling to reveal the raw anger beneath. The sheriff looked surprised, then suspicious. Is that so? The sheriff grunted, shifting his weight in the saddle. Well, that's your right, I suppose. But Clara, you have an arrangement with Mr. Vance here. A contract. A contract made by men who wish to be rid of me, Clara replied, a lifetime of suppressed anger giving her strength. I am not property. My choices are my own. Elias let out a short, harsh laugh. Brave words from a woman with nothing. You'll come with me, Clara. Now. He started to step forward, his hand reaching for her arm. Thomas moved instantly, blocking his path. The two men stood chest to chest, a silent, explosive confrontation. The air was thick with years of bad blood. She said no, Elias, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. The sheriff's hand moved, resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Now, Thomas, let's not have any trouble. The lady is confused. She's had a long trip. It was a warning. The law was not on their side. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Clara knew they had only one chance. They had to get to that line cabin. They had to find Eleanor's proof. But how could they leave with the sheriff and Elias standing guard at their door? Then an idea sparked in her mind. A risky, desperate gamble, born from Eleanor's journal and Thomas's grief. She turned to the sheriff, her eyes wide with carefully crafted fear. "Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling just enough, "I stayed because I was afraid. I saw something last night." Elias and the sheriff both tensed. Thomas shot her a look of confusion. "What did you see, ma'am?" the sheriff asked, leaning forward. Clara took a deep breath. "I saw a light out by the old creek bed. I asked Mr. Thomas about it, and he got angry. He told me to stay away from there. He said it was haunted by his wife's ghost." The lie was a masterpiece of misdirection. It used the town's gossip against them, confirming their suspicions about Thomas while pointing them exactly where she and Thomas needed to go. Elias's eyes narrowed. He exchanged a look with the sheriff. A ghost story was nonsense, but a light by the creek where Eleanor's horse was found. That was interesting. That was a place worth investigating. "A light, you say?" the sheriff drawled, his suspicion shifting. "Thomas, what's out by that creek?" "Nothing," Thomas said, playing his part perfectly, his voice sharp and defensive. "It's my land. Stay off it." His defiance was all the confirmation they needed. Elias swung himself back onto his horse. "Well, now I'm curious," he said with a wolfish grin. "Sheriff, I think we'd better take a ride out to that creek, see what ghosts are rattling around." The sheriff nodded. "You two stay put. We'll be back." With a jingle of harnesses and a cloud of dust, the two men spurred their horses and rode off, heading east toward the dry creek bed, toward the line cabin. They had bought themselves time, but they had also sent their enemies directly to the place where the secret was buried. It was a race. As soon as they were out of sight, Thomas turned to Clara, a look of grudging admiration on his face. "That was a dangerous game." "We didn't have a choice," she said, her adrenaline-fueled courage beginning to fade. "Let's go. We have to get there first." Thomas didn't waste a second. He grabbed the rifle and a small satchel, while Clara pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. They didn't take the wagon. It was too slow, too obvious. They slipped out the back door and ran toward the barn. The horses were already skittish, sensing the tension in the air. Thomas saddled them with practiced speed. He handed Clara the reins to the gentler mare, the same one she had ridden before. "We can't follow the main path," he said, swinging himself into the saddle. "They'll see our dust. We have to cut across the ridge. It's rougher, but it's hidden." They rode hard, the wind whipping at their faces. Clara clung to the reins, her body protesting the rough ride, but she ignored the pain. The fate of two women, one dead and one very much alive, rested on this desperate race. The ridge was steep and rocky, forcing them to slow down. From the top they could see the figures of the sheriff and Elias far below, making their way steadily along the creek bed. They were closer. Faster, Thomas urged, his face grim. They pushed the horses, navigating the treacherous downhill slope. A loose rock tumbled under her mare's hoof, and the horse stumbled with a frightened whinny. Clara held on tight, her heart leaping into her throat, but she managed to keep her seat. They reached the flatlands just as Elias and the sheriff were dismounting near a dilapidated wooden structure, half hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees. The line cabin. They were too late. Thomas pulled his horse to a halt behind a rocky outcrop, signaling for Clara to do the same. They were 100 yards away, close enough to see but not to be seen. They watched as Elias strode to the cabin door and kicked it open. The old wood splintered and fell inward with a crash. He and the sheriff disappeared inside. "What do we do now?" Clara whispered, her hope shriveling. Thomas's jaw was tight. He slid the rifle from its scabbard. "We wait." Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun beat down on them. Clara's mouth was dry as dust. What was happening inside that cabin? Had Eleanor hidden the proof too well? Or had Elias already found it and destroyed it? Then a shout echoed from the cabin. It was a cry of triumph. Elias. He emerged from the dark doorway, holding something in his hand, a small metal box. He pried it open with the tip of his knife and pulled out a stack of papers. A wide, cruel smile spread across his face as he scanned the top page. "He found it," Thomas breathed, his voice hollow. All the fight seemed to go out of him. It was over. Elias held the papers up for the sheriff to see. Even from a distance, Clara could see the sheriff's posture change. He took a step back from Elias, a look of shock on his face. Whatever was in those papers, it was damning. Elias laughed, a sound that carried on the wind, sharp and ugly. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he pulled a match from his pocket, struck it on his boot heel, and set the papers on fire. The proof turned to black ash in his hand. He dropped the burning remains to the ground and crushed them under his heel, grinding the last hope of justice into the dirt. He had won. Elias clapped the sheriff on the shoulder, a gesture that was both friendly and threatening. They mounted their horses and turned back toward the ranch. Toward her. Thomas watched them go, his face a mask of despair. The fight was over. The proof was gone. Eleanor would never have justice, and Clara was now trapped, her lie exposed, at the mercy of a triumphant monster. "There's nothing left," Thomas said, his voice cracking. But Clara was watching the spot where the papers had burned. A small wisp of smoke still curled into the air. Her mind, always working, always noticing the small details, snagged on something Thomas had said earlier. She was quiet, but strong, like a river that runs deep. And something else. A woman hides things inside other things. Elias was arrogant. He was a bully. He assumed he had found everything. He had found a metal box with papers inside. It was exactly what a man would look for. But Eleanor wasn't a man. "He didn't find it," Clara said, a sudden fierce certainty in her voice. Thomas turned to look at her, his eyes full of confusion. "Clara, we saw him burn it." "We saw him burn papers," she corrected. "He found a box." "Of course he did. That was the decoy." She urged her horse forward, out from behind the rocks. "What are you doing?" Thomas hissed, grabbing for her reins. "They'll be back any minute." "Let them come," she said, her gaze fixed on the cabin. "A fire needs fuel, Thomas. What do you burn in a line cabin when you're caught in a winter storm?" He stared at her, the gears in his mind slowly turning. Then his eyes widened in understanding. The woodpile, he whispered. They galloped to the cabin. The inside was dark and smelled of rot and dust. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, a broken table in the center. In the corner, next to a stone fireplace, was a small, neat stack of firewood. It was the last place anyone would think to hide something. It was just firewood. But Clara walked straight to it. She knelt down and began to move the logs one by one. They were dry, dusty. Nothing. She moved another and another. Her hands were getting covered in splinters. Hope began to fade. Maybe she was wrong. Then her fingers brushed against something that wasn't rough bark. It was smooth, too smooth. She pulled out the log. It was shorter than the others, and one end looked different. It wasn't a solid piece of wood. It was hollow. A piece of the bark had been carefully cut and fitted back into place like a lid. With trembling fingers, she pried the lid off. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was another bundle of papers. But these weren't just letters. Tucked inside the folded pages was a small, thin book. A ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, dates, and names. It was a detailed record, a record of stolen cattle, brands that had been altered, and payments from a rustling ring that stretched across 3 counties. And at the bottom of nearly every page, authorizing the sales, was a signature, Elias Vance. But that wasn't the most damning part. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a single, folded document. It was a sworn statement from another rancher, a man who had worked with Elias before his conscience got the better of him. The man had disappeared a year ago, moved back east, or so the story went. The statement detailed how Elias had boasted of his plan to drive Thomas off his land, how he had threatened Eleanor, how he had bragged that his cousin the sheriff would protect him. This wasn't just proof of cattle rustling. This was proof of a conspiracy. It was motive for murder. "This is it," Clara breathed, handing the ledger to Thomas. "This is the real proof." Thomas took it, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. A single harsh sob escaped his lips. It was the sound of a year's worth of grief and injustice finally breaking free. The sound of hoofbeats outside snapped them back to the present. Fast hoofbeats, coming closer. Elias and the sheriff were returning, and they looked angry. They must have realized the decoy. Elias, in his arrogance, had probably started bragging, only to realize the papers he burned were too simple, too easy to find. He knew Eleanor was smarter than that. He knew he'd been tricked. There was no time to run, no time to hide. Thomas shoved the ledger into his satchel and pulled the rifle to his shoulder, positioning himself by the window. Clara's mind raced. The ledger was everything, but it was still just their word against the word of a respected rancher and the law. They needed more. They needed a confession. The horses skidded to a halt outside. "Thomas!" Elias's voice was a furious roar. "You and your woman get out here now. You've got something that belongs to me." Thomas didn't answer. He just sighted down the barrel of his rifle. Clara looked around the dusty cabin, her eyes darting from the empty fireplace to the broken door. And then she saw it. An old rusted bear trap, hanging on the wall, its metal jaws coated in a thin layer of grime. An idea, terrible and desperate, took shape. It was a long shot, a wild gamble that could get them both killed. She grabbed Thomas's arm. "Don't shoot," she whispered urgently. "Not yet. I have a plan. You have to trust me." He looked at her, his face a grim knot of anger and indecision. Outside, Elias was shouting again, threatening to burn the cabin down around them. "Trust me," she repeated, her eyes boring into his. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. Clara took a deep breath and walked to the shattered doorway, stepping out into the blinding sunlight. She held her hands up, showing they were empty. "We don't want any trouble, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. Elias, still on his horse, sneered down at her. The sheriff had his gun drawn, aimed squarely at the cabin door. "Trouble is what you've got, old woman," Elias spat. "Give me the ledger. Give it to me now, and I might let you walk away from this." "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara said, forcing a look of confusion onto her face. "The only thing in that cabin is dust and bad memories." Elias's face contorted with rage. He dismounted, grabbing a rope from his saddle. "You think you're clever, don't you? You and him? Well, I'm done playing games." He started walking toward her, coiling the rope in his hands. The sheriff shifted uneasily. "Elias, maybe we should just wait him out." "Wait for what?" Elias snarled, never taking his eyes off Clara. "For him to build a fortress in there. She knows where it is. I'll get it out of her." He was close now, so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath. This was her only chance. She backed away slowly, drawing him farther from his horse, farther from the sheriff. She stumbled deliberately, letting out a small cry as she fell to the ground near the cabin's crumbling stone foundation. "Please," she whimpered, playing the part of the helpless victim she had been forced to be her whole life. Elias loomed over her, a cruel smirk on his face. He raised the rope. "Last chance, Clara. Where is it?" "It's not here," she cried. "It's buried. Eleanor buried it." "Where?" he demanded, leaning closer, his face inches from hers. "She buried it," Clara said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "under the one thing she knew you'd never touch." "What's that?" Elias growled, impatient. "Her mother's headstone," Clara lied, pointing toward the small, fenced-off family cemetery on a nearby hill. "She told me. She said you were too much of a coward to ever disturb a grave." The taunt hit its mark. Elias's eyes flashed with fury. It was a perfect lie. It preyed on his arrogance and his superstition. He glanced toward the cemetery, his greed momentarily overriding his caution. And in that split second of distraction, Thomas moved. He didn't fire the rifle. He threw it. The heavy weapon spun through the air and slammed into the back of Elias's knees, buckling his legs. Elias roared in pain and surprise as he stumbled forward, directly into the trap Clara had led him to. His foot landed on the pressure plate of the bear trap, which Clara had dragged from the cabin and hidden under a thin layer of dust and leaves just moments before. There was a sickening thwump of metal, followed by a scream of agony that echoed across the prairie. The trap's iron jaws slammed shut on Elias's leg, just above the ankle. He collapsed to the ground, writhing and howling, the bone clearly shattered. The sheriff, stunned by the sudden, brutal turn of events, hesitated for just a moment too long. Thomas was already out of the cabin, scooping up the rifle. He didn't aim it at the sheriff. He aimed it at Elias, who was now sobbing in the dirt. "It's over, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice hard as iron. "Drop your gun." The sheriff looked from his cousin, bleeding and trapped on the ground, to the cold, determined face of Thomas, and then to Clara, who was already getting to her feet, her face grim but resolute. He saw the ledger in Thomas's other hand. He knew in that moment that the game was up. All the lies, all the cover-ups had just been snapped shut in that rusty trap. Slowly, reluctantly, the sheriff lowered his pistol and let it fall to the dust. The ride back to town was slow and silent, except for the pained groans of Elias Vance, who was slumped over his saddle, his trapped leg wrapped in bloody rags. Thomas rode beside him, rifle across his lap, while Clara rode with the sheriff, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last hour. When they reached the town, word spread like wildfire. People came out of the mercantile and the saloon, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Elias Vance, the wealthy, powerful rancher, brought in like a common criminal. And the quiet, grieving Thomas, a man they had all whispered about, was the one who had brought him to justice. Thomas didn't take Elias to the sheriff's office. He took him to the center of town, right in front of the telegraph office. He pulled him from his horse and threw him in the dust for all to see. "This man is a thief and a rustler," Thomas's voice boomed, filled with a year of righteous anger. "And I have the proof." He held up the ledger. "He threatened my wife, Eleanor, and when she stood up to him, he made her disappear. He is a coward and a murderer." A murmur went through the crowd. This was more than just gossip now. This was a public accusation, backed by a man bleeding in the street. The sheriff, shamed and defeated, took the ledger from Thomas. He opened it, his face pale as he looked at the evidence of his cousin's crimes and his own complicity. Clara watched it all, standing slightly apart from the crowd. She had not come west for this. She had come for a quiet life, a safe place to hide from the world. Instead, she had found herself in the middle of a war. But for the first time, she hadn't been a victim. She had been a fighter. She had used her wits, her courage, and the lifetime of pain that had taught her how to read the cruelty in a man's eyes. Elias Vance was arrested. His cousin, the sheriff, was forced to resign in disgrace, his silence having made him an accomplice. The story in the ledger was even worse than they had imagined, implicating a dozen other men in the county. It was a rot that went deep, and Thomas and Clara had just exposed it to the light. Weeks later, the dust had settled, both literally and figuratively. Thomas's name was cleared. The whispers about him died down, replaced by a quiet respect. He was no longer the strange, grieving widower, but the man who had brought down the Vance gang. But the question of what happened to Eleanor remained. With Elias in jail, he finally confessed. He hadn't killed her. He had ambushed her on the way to town, but she had fought back fiercely. She escaped on foot, vanishing into the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the high desert. Elias, panicking, had faked the scene at the creek to make it look like she had drowned. He assumed the wilderness would finish the job for him. She was still out there, or she was gone forever. There was no way to know. The shadow of her disappearance still hung over the ranch. One evening, as the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of orange and purple, Thomas found Clara sitting on the porch. The ranch was quiet now, a peacefulness it hadn't known in over a year. "I can't thank you enough, Clara," he said, his voice soft. "You saved me. You gave Eleanor the justice I couldn't." Clara looked out at the endless horizon. "She was the one who did it. I just read the map she left behind." A comfortable silence fell between them. They had been through a fire together and had come out the other side, scarred but not broken. The house no longer felt like a place of secrets and fear. It felt like a home. "The arrangement you had," Thomas said carefully, "the one with Elias, it's void now, of course. You're free to go wherever you please. I have enough money to buy you a ticket on the train, send you anywhere you'd like to go." Clara was silent for a long time. She thought of the life she had left behind, a life of bruises and silence. She thought of the journey west, of the fear and the loneliness. She could leave. She could start over somewhere new, somewhere no one knew her name or her story. But as she looked at the mended fences, at the sturdy barn, at the man standing beside her, his face weathered but his eyes kind and full of a quiet strength she had come to admire, she realized she didn't want to run anymore. She had spent 50 years being told where to go, who to be. She had been passed from one man to another like a worn-out coat. But here, on this small patch of land, she had found her own voice. She had found her own strength. "I don't think I want to go anywhere," she said quietly, turning to look at him. I think I'm already home." Thomas's breath hitched. A slow smile spread across his face, a real smile this time, one that reached his sad eyes and filled them with a light she had never seen before. It wasn't a grand proposal. It wasn't a declaration of passionate love. It was something quieter, deeper. Two lonely, wounded people finding solace in each other's company, and understanding that home isn't a place you go to, but a person you build a life with. But just as a new future seemed to be dawning, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a cloud of dust. It was the telegraph boy from town, riding as if the devil himself were on his heels. He galloped right up to the porch and handed a yellow envelope to Thomas. "Came in an hour ago, Mr. Thomas. Marked urgent." Thomas's hands trembled as he tore it open. Clara watched his face, saw the color drain from it, saw his eyes widen in utter, profound shock. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of joy and disbelief, so intense it was painful to see. He couldn't speak. He just handed her the flimsy piece of paper. Her eyes scanned the short typed message. "Thomas. Stop. I am alive. Stop. Made it to California. Stop. Coming home. Stop. Eleanor." Eleanor was alive. The world seemed to stop spinning. The woman whose ghost had haunted the ranch, whose memory had been the catalyst for everything, was alive. The justice they had won for her wasn't for a ghost. It was for a living, breathing woman. A woman who was coming back to her home, coming back to her husband. Clara looked at Thomas, who was still staring at the telegraph, as if it might vanish from his hands. The joy on his face was pure, absolute. The wife he had mourned for a year was returning, and in that single devastating moment, Clara realized her newfound home was no longer hers. She was, once again, the outsider. A temporary guest in someone else's life, in someone else's love story. The quiet peace she had just found was a mirage, about to be swept away by the woman who rightfully belonged there. She had helped save a man's soul, only to lose her own place in the world. Eleanor was coming home, and Clara had nowhere left to go. The days that followed the arrival of the telegraph were a strange, suspended limbo. Thomas was a changed man. The deep, settled grief that had been his constant companion was gone, replaced by a nervous, joyful energy. He fixed the loose shutter on the porch. He repaired the rocking chair that had been Eleanor's favorite. He worked from sunup to sundown, pouring all his anxious hope into preparing the ranch, making it perfect for his wife's return. He was kind to Clara, kinder than ever. He thanked her again and again, telling her that none of this would be possible without her. But his eyes were always looking down the road, watching for a dust cloud that would signal Eleanor's arrival. Clara watched him, a hollow ache in her chest. She helped him, of course. She cleaned the house until it shone. She aired out the linens in Eleanor's room, a room she had never dared to enter before. She cooked Thomas's favorite meals. She played the part of the happy friend, the helpful guest, all while her own fragile hope crumbled to dust inside her. She told herself she should be happy for them, and she was. But she was also heartbroken. She had allowed herself, for the first time in her life, to feel like she belonged somewhere. It had been a mistake. She packed her small satchel, the same one she had arrived with. She had a little money saved, enough for a train ticket. She didn't know where she would go. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that she had to leave. She couldn't be here when Eleanor arrived. She couldn't watch their reunion. It would break what was left of her heart. She decided to leave in the morning, before dawn. She would write a short note, slip away, and disappear, just as she had always done. That night a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled around the corners of the house. Thomas built up the fire in the hearth, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "She always loved a good storm," he said, more to himself than to Clara. "She said it was the land washing itself clean." He looked over at Clara, who was mending one of his shirts by lamplight. Her hands were steady, but her heart was a turbulent sea. "Clara," he said, his voice serious, "we need to talk about what happens when she gets here." This was it, the conversation she had been dreading. He was going to ask her to leave. She put down her sewing, bracing herself. You don't have to say it, Thomas. I'll be gone in the morning. He looked genuinely shocked. Gone? Why would you be gone? This is your home. The words were a cruel twist of the knife. It's not my home, Thomas. It's hers. I was just passing through. No, he said, shaking his head fiercely. He stood up and walked over to her, his expression intense. That's not true. What you did here, the courage you showed. You didn't just clear my name, you brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life. He knelt in front of her, taking her worn hands in his. I love Eleanor. I will always love her. What we had, it was the foundation of this ranch. But a year is a long time. People change. What she endured, what I endured. We're not the same people who said goodbye on that road a year ago. Clara stared at him, confused. What was he trying to say? When Eleanor comes back, he continued, his voice low and earnest, she will not be returning to the life she left, and I will not be the husband she remembers. We will have to find our way again. But this ranch is big enough. My heart is big enough. He took a deep breath. I want you to stay, Clara. Not as a guest, not as a helper, but as family, as part of this place. Whatever the future holds for me and Eleanor, you belong here with us. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. No one had ever called her family. No one had ever claimed her, not out of duty or pity, but out of genuine respect and care. It was a future she could never have imagined, a strange, complicated, messy future, sharing a home with a man and his wife. But it was a future where she wasn't alone. But before she could answer, the storm outside seemed to intensify. A frantic pounding came from the front door, barely audible over the roar of the wind. It wasn't a knock. It was the desperate beating of fists. Thomas and Clara exchanged a look of alarm. Who would be out in a storm like this? Thomas grabbed the rifle and opened the door. A figure stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her dress torn and caked with mud. She pushed back her wet, matted hair from her face and looked up. Her eyes, wide with exhaustion and terror, found Thomas's. "Thomas," she rasped, her voice a fragile whisper. It was Eleanor. She wasn't on a stagecoach due to arrive in a week. She was here. Now. And she hadn't come from the direction of town. She had come from the wilderness. From the east, the direction of the Vance Ranch. And she was not alone. Clinging to her hand was a small child, no older than 5, with wide, frightened eyes and hair the color of corn silk. Thomas stared, frozen, at the woman he thought he had lost forever, and at the child he had never seen before. The telegraph had been a lie. A trap. Eleanor hadn't escaped to California. She had been a prisoner. And the boy had Elias Vance's eyes. The story Eleanor told was a nightmare. She hadn't escaped from Elias that day. He had caught her, dragged her to a hidden, isolated cabin deep in the canyons on the far side of his property. He kept her there, a prisoner for over a year, telling the world she had drowned. The boy, Samuel, was his son from a previous, secret marriage to a woman who had died in childbirth. Elias kept the boy hidden, ashamed of the boy's frail health. Eleanor had been forced to care for the child, becoming a mother to the son of her own captor. It was a twisted, cruel mockery of a family. When Elias was arrested, the men who worked for him, the remnants of his rustling gang, kept her locked away. They knew she was a witness who could hang them all. But the storm had been her chance. In the chaos she had taken the boy and fled, running for miles through the rain and darkness, guided only by the faint, distant light of Thomas's lamp. The child, Samuel, huddled by the fire, wrapped in one of Clara's shawls. He was small for his age, and his breathing was shallow. He watched them all with a silent, haunted gaze. He had known nothing but captivity his entire life. Thomas was a storm of emotions. The joy of seeing his wife alive was at war with the horror of what she had endured. He looked at Eleanor, seeing the new hard lines around her eyes, the trauma that had been carved into her soul. Then he looked at the boy, the living embodiment of his enemy's legacy. Clara moved quietly, efficiently. She made hot broth for Eleanor and the boy. She found dry clothes. She tended to them not as an outsider, but as the steady, capable heart of the home she had become. In the chaos, her role was clear. She was the calm in the center of the storm. Later that night, after Eleanor and the boy were asleep, Thomas and Clara sat by the dying fire. The house was quiet again, but the silence was heavy with unspoken questions. "She's not the woman I married," Thomas said, his voice thick with a grief that was new and somehow deeper than before. "And he's not my son." Clara looked at him, her own heart aching for his pain, for Eleanor's, for the little boy asleep in the other room. "He is an innocent child, Thomas. He is not his father." "I know," Thomas said, running a hand through his hair. "But what am I to do, Clara? She needs me. But she is a stranger, and this new life she has brought with her." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The future he had so joyfully anticipated a few hours ago had vanished. In its place was a complicated, painful reality. A traumatized wife, a sick child who was a constant reminder of his enemy, and Clara. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since Eleanor had collapsed through the door. He saw the quiet strength, the unwavering competence, the compassion in her eyes. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't hesitated. She had simply cared for the broken people who had fallen into her home. He had told her she was family. Now he realized just how true that was. She wasn't an addition to his life with Eleanor. She was the anchor that was holding them all together. "Stay," he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, Clara, don't leave us. We can't do this without you." It was the second time he had asked her to stay. The first time he had been offering her a home. This time he was asking her to help him rebuild one from the ashes. The path ahead was not the simple one of peace and quiet love she had briefly imagined. It was a path of healing, of patience, of forging a new kind of family from the most broken of pieces. It would be hard. It would be painful. But as she looked at this good, struggling man, she knew she couldn't leave. Her own journey from a life of pain had led her here, not to find a quiet place to rest, but to become a source of strength for others who were hurting. Her own healing would come not from hiding from the world, but from helping to mend its broken places. "I'll stay," she said, and for the first time the words felt not like a compromise, but like a purpose. Sometimes the life we find is not the one we were looking for. Sometimes family is not born of blood, but forged in fire. For Clara, Thomas, Eleanor, and a little boy named Samuel, the journey was far from over. But they would face it together, a strange and unlikely family, bound by the scars of the past and a stubborn hope for the future. They remind us that even after the worst storms, the sun can rise again, and a home can be built anywhere there is courage, compassion, and a willingness to love what is broken. If this story of resilience and the surprising ways a family can be made touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more tales from the Wild West. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what it truly means to build a home. We read every word because your stories matter too.